Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm Brian. I'm the host of the Left of Greg show. You're going to be watching the video version of our audio podcast. Please, guys, if you like the video, like it, subscribe to the channel. There's going to be more content on there if you're already a subscriber, and a better way for us to get you guys some more stuff. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below. Check out our links down below to get a hold of us and to actually find out more places where you can get more information about this. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Facebook at HBPRNA. Remember, all these cases that we discuss and all these discussions that we have are through the lenses of what we call human behavior, pattern recognition, and analysis. So please like it, share it, tell your friends about it, and we hope you enjoy the show. Thanks. All right, so Greg, it's you, me, and Sean, of course, we have today. And I know before we got started on this amazing case we're going to talk about of Kansas versus Glover, you have your usual segment of what grinds my gears, Peter Griffin style. So
I just want to welcome Sean back. For all those listeners, Sean is apparently broadcasting from a barrel, half-gallon drum barrel in his garage, but its sound quality couldn't be better. Now, Brian, what pissed me off is everybody knows, and I'm holding up the card, it was the Marine Corps' birthday this past weekend, followed by Veterans Day. Thanks, everybody that was a vet. And what do I read in the paper Monday morning on Veterans Day? I don't read happy birthday to the Marine Corps, and I don't read thanks for all the vets that are in our audience. What I hear is Ariana Huffington giving a happy birthday to Anne Hathaway, two other people. November's Resilience Month here at Arcadia, and I'm just trying to tell you how hard it is staying laser focused on resilience when so many factors in the media are against us.
Just for those listening who don't know who Ariana Huffington is, just substitute Ariana Grande. I don't know.
Yeah, or the Huffington Post or
whoever.
Absolutely anything. My idea is that those who know, and the problem with our society right now is we're upside down with a bunch of people that are tilting at windmills and not paying attention to the real issues on the ground.
Yeah,
and I think, Brian, that's why.
Yeah, that's pop culture. I think is gonna be like that for forever.
No.
But there's people still contributing, doing what they're doing as they always have, which is what makes our country amazing. But the counterpoint to that, not counterpoint, but yeah, I agree. Is just they're gonna capitalize off of other people's hard work, but they're that a lot of people aren't going to give respect, but there are a lot of people out there who do, which I appreciate. And I think that's changed a lot over the last few years, for sure.
And the reason we brought Shon Clemons on today is because he's a lifelong friend of Anne Hathaway. So,
oh yeah, good.
I'm ready to discuss Arcadia.
So,
I wish I knew who that was.
So, all right. So,
pop culture.
The case of, speaking of pop culture, this is for anyone who wants more good information about this case or the other one, you can go ahead and sign up at scotusblog.org, which you have to be a huge nerd to be a member of, but that's okay, because we're talking about the Supreme Court of the United States, specifically Kansas v. Glover. All right, so I'm just going to go over the basic facts of this case, and then we'll kind of get into it from there. But just to go over this, the parties, meaning the state of Kansas and Charles Glover, have stipulated to the following facts of this case. This is an important one that the Supreme Court has not decided yet, but it is up for review. So, while on a routine morning patrol in or around Lawrence, Kansas, Sheriff Deputy Mark Marer saw a 1995 Chevy 1500 pickup and decided to run a check on the registration. Deputy Mayer had not witnessed any traffic violations. The database check showed that the truck belonged to Charles Glover and that Glover's license had been revoked. Sheriff Mayer did not see who was driving. He assumed it was Glover, the registered owner. When Mayer stopped the truck, he discovered that Glover was in fact driving, and Glover was eventually charged as a habitual violator for driving with a revoked license. Okay, so basic, simple facts of the case. A police officer runs a license plate. It comes back as, the person, had their license had been revoked, right? So he pulls him over, and it was the person, in fact, registered the vehicle. But the reason why we're discussing this case and the reason why it's gotten to the Supreme Court is because there are a lot of issues with this case, right? So, one of them being whether, for the purpose of investigative stop under the Fourth Amendment, it is reasonable for an officer to suspect that the registered owner of the vehicle is the one driving. the vehicle absent any information to the contrary. Meaning, kind of what a lot of this case comes down to is, can the police stop a vehicle because its registered owner's license has been suspended or revoked? So before we go too far, Greg or Shon, do you want to give kind of a brief understanding, maybe a street definition or explanation of the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution and how that applies?
Yeah, let me throw it at. I'll do the color, and Shon, you do the play-by-play. Fourth Amendment basically guarantees that all people will be secure in their papers and effects, and no warrant shall issue except based on probable cause, meaning that a person goes to a judge and swears on it, and therefore you don't have to worry about intrusive, unwarranted searches and seizures. Shon?
Yeah, just I guess, and that's backed up with a lot of case law through the Supreme Court. The big pillar, I guess, would be the Terry versus Ohio,
Right.
also known as the Terry stop or a Terry frisk. If you guys want to look up the case, you can. It's a good case, but it basically, it tells about an officer has to have some type of specific facts, and he has to be able to articulate those facts in order to make a stop and then make a frisk thereafter. That was decided sometimes. What was that, in the 60s, guys?
Yes.
Yep,
So that was, late 60s. And I know we'll probably get to Terry v. Ohio again. I know that was something that immediately, I'm sure Greg as well, that I thought of on this case. But the idea was the guy's pulled over, right? He had a revoked license and he was then arrested. But then his argument is, hey, that shouldn't matter. The traffic stop his argument would be the traffic stop violated the Fourth Amendment, prohibition against unreasonable searches and seizures, because the officer lacked any type of reasonable suspicion that a crime had been committed. So I think we can kind of start there, Greg.
No, and I think it's a good argument. And Shon and I went back and forth when this first came out that SCOTUS was deciding, and I think for the first time in 25 years of sparring with Shon, almost 30 years, and I didn't value his side of the argument. So I'll let him make his side. My point is that drivers don't have all the privacy rights that they think. In many instances, law enforcement officers are allowed procedurally to pull over cars. And whenever the registered owner of a car has a revoked or suspended license, prior to confirming that, the police officer should reasonably believe that the owner is in fact the driver behind the wheel, unless there's other factors that are in play. And if you look at this case very closely, the Kansas copper pulled over Charles Glover. He said he did it based on the hunch that the driver was in fact the owner of the vehicle. And I think that's reasonable. And if we're talking about a reasonable argument, what more argument is reasonable that the person driving the car registered to you with insurance registered to you is the licensed driver that's the owner of that car? I think it's a common sense inference that it's one and the same.
So I originally agreed with that. Real quick before I go to you, Shon, with that same thing, right? So if if a vehicle is registered to a person, that vehicle, it's likely to assume that that's the person driving.
Yep.
But actually, to go to I think the initial judge in the case said, well, actually, on that argument, I'm not going to agree with you on. I personally have 3 vehicles at my house registered to me. I only drive one of them. The other 2 are driven by family members, and I almost have never driven those vehicles. So the counter argument to that would be it could belong to anyone in the household. Before we get on, I mean, Shon, what would you have to say to that argument, or kind of so far where we're at in the case?
Well, I would say let's go back to the case again. We gave the fact simple caper. It was a stop based off of him running the plate and thinking or assuming that this was the driver without any other facts that he could articulate. Which, if maybe he would have articulated some more facts, his standard of proof may have risen to a reasonable suspicion. What I'm concerned about is that we're creating something new called a reasonable assumption. I'm going to reasonably assume that this is the driver just because the person's behind the wheel, and therefore I can run the driver license status and assume that person is the driver, pull them over, and then arrest them or issue a violation. So I guess backing it up to the case is we have to remember that the district court ruled against the police in this caper, threw the case out. The case was taken up to the next level of Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals reinstated the case and said the officer had reasonable suspicion, even though it was, like Red said, a reasonable assumption. I think is what the officer was saying. A hunch wouldn't rise to a suspicion, at least in my eyes. I think it's more of an assumption. And then that got kicked up to the Kansas State Supreme Court, who then again knocked the case down and dismissed the case. So the case went back and forth. Now it's at the Supreme Court level. So it has a lot of implications to millions of drivers all over America. So people should be interested everywhere as to how this caper plays out, which will affect their ability to go about freely without unreasonable searches and seizures. So just go ahead, guys.
Yeah, so and that goes to the heart of kind of what the state of Kansas is arguing, right? So they said, I'll read it here. An officer may reasonably suspect that the registered owner of a vehicle is the driver of his or her vehicle, where the officer lacks information to the contrary, right? So I think that's a big part of the case, is that, you know, if you run a plate or someone's driving a vehicle, is it reasonable to assume that the person driving the vehicle is the registered owner of the vehicle? And I would think, just, I'm no law enforcement experience, just me, average person on the street, I would say yes. I would say more times than not, the person who's driving a vehicle on any road and at any time is likely the owner of the vehicle. Is that, I would think that's a reasonable assumption. Greg, I don't know what your thought on
so apparently that's SCOTUS calling us now for an opinion.
Right now.
I apologize. We're still at work, everybody. Listen, I agree with the general argument that I think I'm hearing you guys lay out, that this weakens aspects of the probable cause argument. But what we're talking about here is a motor vehicle, and we're talking about a procedural task, a paperwork shuffle, and in motor vehicles and procedural tasks, the courts always recognize that there's a lesser expectation of privacy. And also, because you're driving, it's implied consent. You're consenting to the fact that if you're on a road, that you have to have all these documents in order. So it's only reasonable for a police officer routinely to say, hey, listen, I've done this check, no malice intended, no profile intended. It wasn't a random thing. I just happened to see a vehicle and run the plate, and all of a sudden it came up as revoked. And I made the logical assumption that the vehicle's registered owner is likely the person that's driving. Now, the second part of what you said, Brian, is absent other information. And Sean,
Right.
I think that speaks directly to tinted windows or 4x4s or, nighttime, for example, where you can't see inside the car. But your argument, Sean, is that not only does it weaken probable cause, but I think I'm hearing, Sean, that you're also saying it weakens the ability of the police to actually look up and off the MDT and do their job.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what we're all about at Arcadia is training and making individuals better at what they do. I would also fall back to this case has already been decided years ago. We were taught in the police academy a caper back in the 70s, Delaware versus Prowse, if anybody's interested in looking it up. Another simple caper. Police officer stops a car for no other purpose than to check the license status and the registration, procedural, as you're saying, Greg, to check that status of that operator and that motor vehicle's registration. As he gets up there, he sees marijuana in plain view, arrests the guy. The guy ended up having a valid license and registration. So case is tossed. The court rules that you can't pull someone over for making a routine check of the license or registration absent observing some type of criminal activity or a traffic violation. That seems reasonable to me.
Okay,
So
but let me ask you this, Sean. Let's put it in the context of an equipment violation.
Right.
You see the vehicle going, and there's a jacket hanging out of a closed door. The trunk is loose and it's slamming. You see that the taillight's out, and you go, wow, that's interesting to me. So I'm going to make a traffic stop and tell the person, hey, listen, your lug nut is loose. Okay, those are all something normal procedural function that a law enforcement officer protecting our society on the roads would do. Now, if he does that and you flee from him, or he does that and you don't have a license or a registration, or he does that and he sees sitting on a bale of cocaine, those would likely be allowed because it wasn't a malicious intent when he originally stopped. And I know I'm adding the malicious nature of it, but remember, most profiling leads to bad capers because profiling is wrong. But if it's a pretext and a profile based on a reasonable assumption, and when folks, we're talking about profile, we're not talking about color of the driver, color of the car. What we're talking about is, hey, listen, at this time of night, coming down this street in this area when the vehicle's weighed down, it's always human smuggling or some other factor. And the copper has enough experience and acumen that he can testify to that and be cross-examined. And Shon, my thing is on this argument, if this very, very narrow, what I see as a narrow intrusion based on evidence, based on the fact that a computer told this officer, and hey, listen, somebody that owns this vehicle is revoked, I think that that's enough, because the idea is if the case was so, if it pivoted so much on the officer's observation, my question, Brian and Shon, is why didn't they call the officer to the stand to testify? The defendant was never cross-examined. I think the officer's testimony wasn't even taken in consideration. So if this is such an important case on what the officer saw, smelled, felt, tasted, and I completely agree with Shon's argument on human performance. We're trying to increase human performance, but I think this is the wrong case. I don't think this is the case that we should draw the line in the sand on.
Yeah, I think you're conflating the case. You said an equipment violation. Well, that alone, that gets the officer to stop the car. And this one, we have nothing.
Yeah, but we did have something. We had a computer that told the person that it was revoked. Yeah. Shon, my argument would be here, what if it was a bolo? What if a bolo came across a police radio saying, hey, heads up for suspicious activity? Would you say, well, that's not enough?
That brings up, I think, a major part of it, and what's kind of hasn't all completely been decided yet is how we use these different technologies, right? Because just like you said, is a be on the lookout. If it was a license plate reader that was looking for, an Amber Alert just went out, and this vehicle was identified as someone who just kidnapped a child, and then we're okay with that technology to read that plate and identify that vehicle. But if that same technology then says, hey, you're also behind, you don't have a registered vehicle or you have a revoked license, now we don't like that. And then I would liken it too, same thing is with those different technology partners where, you've got in major metropolitan cities where they can go by and scan your vehicle and go, oh, you have unpaid parking tickets, we'll give you another one, or we'll tow you, or you did this. But, so it's kind of almost, I think that's a big part of it, is where do we draw the line in terms of civil liberties, though?
And Brian and Shon, I want to jump on both you and Brian on this one. We're talking about a person that the owner of the car had a revoked license.
Yes.
You don't get your license revoked.
Right.
Easily.
But forgetting to pay your,
You did a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
So when I talk, and yes, you're right, Shon, I did conflate it by adding stuff that wasn't in the caper or the case in chief about the equipment violation. But I think that those are lesser included. I think that once you get to a suspension or you get to a multiple suspension with the conviction and then you get to a revocation, I think anything goes, because that would be like hey, listen, I had special knowledge that, this person has driven many times and then has a revoked license. And you and I would set up for that guy to see if, in fact, he was driving. What's the difference from getting a computer hit on it and then assuming, only based on the fact that that computer hit, that it's the right guy? I think that intrusion is so small that you don't need more than a Band-Aid to fix it, and it should have never gone to the Supreme Court. And I know you're going to argue with me on that one.
Well, I just think there's so many spirals there. There's so many, undone ends on this case that will, this is going to have a ripple effect, like throwing a rock into a pond. There'll be ripples throughout America that are going to affect people that aren't lawbreakers. And I think that we have to maybe guard we have enough gimmies in law enforcement, I think. And in no way am I defending this guy. I'm not defending any bad behavior. I'm just saying we have a ton of gimmies in law enforcement that we can work our way to a traffic stop. Now we're going to rely upon automated license plate readers to now become police officers. We have police officers to think and to act, right, and use their training effectively, and their training in constitutional law. We don't need to rely on computers to tell us, stop this car because. I'm with you to the point where he runs the dish, right? And then for whatever reason, because remember, it's a multiple step. You run the plate, right? And then you get the registered owner. And then you got to punch in that registered owner and get his driving status, and then get his convictions, then get his complete unedited driving history. So he had to do a bunch of steps where maybe if you'd have looked up and out, or maybe he would have tied it together and said, hey, this is a male born in 43, and the guy I see in front of me, this guy's 35 years old. There's no way this is the guy.
Right.
What's the course of the police? If he goes, the registered owner is 75 years old. This guy here is 35, and I don't know his age. I apologize. He walks up there knowing that's not the registered owner, but the Supreme Court said that I can stop based only what this computer says it's a revoked license. I'm going to make that traffic stop, and I know it's not the guy. And then I walk up there, and then I got plain view, similar to Delaware versus Probes, where now I've got marijuana. Now I make the arrest because you know
right.
he's not going to let him go as soon as he walks up there and says, "Can I see your license?"
And
that's
Shon,
what I'm arguing.
And I get that. One more step back and take a look at Terry in the light that Terry occurred. We now have a whole bunch of spirals that came out of that are much more positive in the light of law enforcement and personal protections as well. For example, plain feel. Then we talk about plain smell. And then we talk about plain sound. These are now exceptions to the search warrant rule where an officer can articulate the facts that he smelled, tasted, felt when he was in a place under color of law that he's allowed to be. So I think that when we look at technology is just another vehicle, no pun intended, that gets us closer to having a panacea of potential choices before we contact the driver. Now, there are specific rights that you have in your house and in your person and in your personal effects, but there's a less expectation of privacy rights in a vehicle. And so procedurally, if this cop, and I'll tell you right now, Shon, the one thing I do agree with you on is MDT policemen got to go. I mean, the MDT should make it safer for you to walk up on a traffic stop. It shouldn't be the precursor to all traffic stops. And what you're talking about is
what drew my ire. Not to interrupt you there, but that's what drew my ire when we originally started talking about this caper. That once again, when we put the MDTs, and that's dating Greg and I, that's dating us because the MDTs now they've got laptops and all that fancy computers that print tickets and. So the MDTs in our day, before there were no MDTs, and then they put the MDTs in, and it created what, like we talked, MDT
pandemonium. Yeah. Well,
right.
And Brian, just so you know, what Shon's trying to explain is we had to learn in a world where you had one dispatcher, and there was probably a National Crime Information Center computer that had these big reams of paper, and you could enter a serial number to a gun and all that other stuff. It was not like now where you run a date of birth and a name and all this other stuff, wants and warrants, and you can tell how many people stopped it.
Right.
So therefore, coppers were better on the street because the copper goes, hey, listen, this piqued my interest because these anomalies were above or below the baseline.
And I think that's kind of part what Shon was getting at here with the whole point of this stop was that, what did he need? If he had nothing else but this technology to base that stop on, then why are we relying on a technology then? If he didn't do anything else, if there were no other factors or contributing reasons why he pulled someone over, I think that's the issue. And to go back to even that's what Terry v. Ohio was too. You folks can look that up. But you had a guys like, look, I've been a detective in this area for 30 years.
Exactly.
This is the behavior I witnessed. This is why I stopped them. Because
he articulated it, Brian. That's where you're hitting
very
on.
clearly.
That's the difference in these papers.
But my argument. My argument to both of you is simply this. Charles Glover being on the road makes the road a more dangerous place for the citizens at large, for my son, for his new wife, for your kids, and therefore Glover should not have the protection of anonymity. And even though this guy stumbled across this information and should have been doing other things, he still got there. And he didn't do it illegally, so therefore Glover should be confirmed.
He still has the protection of the laws and civil liberties in the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, right? I mean, you're rising that saying, well, he's a rule breaker or he didn't pay because he got his license revoked. That's fine, but he still gets the protections of the U.S. Constitution. I mean, I don't think this rises to. I don't know what his driving record was or why his license was revoked because it technically shouldn't matter in the case, right? I mean, it just here's the facts, here's the circumstances of the case, I should say. And
it wasn't too egregious. He only wrote him a violation, so it wasn't like this. This was a major caper, but it turned into one. Obviously, I think it's being challenged. It should have been challenged by a driver who was operating a vehicle with a valid license and that was stopped.
That's the
Right.
point. That's the point, because then you could
this case
say
is being argued by the government the wrong way. I think the government should have waited, pass on this caper, let the man go, argue, because there's dozens. If you look up, there's dozens of these cases.
Yes.
I mean, when I worked the road, they were going on every day. We had the MDT police all day long, and so Greg, when you had to work with one of these guys,
exactly, and it
they
should be a
weren't looking
class
at
action
anything
suit.
besides that computer.
It should be a class action lawsuit brought by the American Civil Liberties Union.
There you
and
go.
It should be for all the good drivers out there. And Brian, that's my point. My point is that, yes, Charles Glover has the same rights, but he also has responsibilities, Brian. And therefore, he knew or should have known he shouldn't have been driving. And therefore, this case doesn't hold water with me. It doesn't hold the mud. And so my thing is that anything that you argue about the computer here, I'm going, hey, good on the copper, based on the fact that Glover needed to get off the road. So I'm being, and it's not flippant, Brian, but I'm giving this a little more latitude than I would if I was stopped and I was doing everything right. I got stopped. I'm not going to say the jurisdiction, but I got stopped. It's got to be 5 years ago now. Never, knock on everything holy, never had a ticket in my life. All the times that I got stopped before this were on duty while we were undercover, following somebody or doing a surveillance, and a copper goes, something's not right. And those were all legit stops because we were definitely doing stuff wrong. But this one, it's a night, and Nico and I are coming back from hockey. Shelly's in the Bronco with us. And as we're driving through this one jurisdiction, this guy drives by the opposite way. And I'd just come back from a place that's notorious for bad things. I had my beard and I looked really ragged and I was tired as hell. And doing the speed limit on a side street, and the copper went zipping by at 10 miles, 15 miles an hour over the speed limit, flashed his spotlight into the cab of my vehicle, illuminated me, and clearly I looked like the guy from the Amityville Horror. You remember the guy with the axe? And so the copper does a flip, he hits the red and blues, pulls up on me, doesn't ask for a cover card, doesn't do anything right on the stop, and bounces up to me right away and says, hey, driver's license registration. I handed him everything. I said, hey, why'd you stop me? And he goes, I don't have to tell you that. Well, first of all, you absolutely do have to tell me that. What's your probable cause? So I said, you better call your supervisor, because I'm the guy that's going to test your knowledge of the 4th and 14th Amendments and what traffic stops are all about. If you've done nothing wrong, you should vigorously defend it. Charles Glover did something wrong, so he can take a step back, and we should be siding with capers that have to do with the public at large that didn't do anything wrong. So Sean, I guess I'm siding with you, but for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I think we're trying to argue the same point, but just in different ways.
Precisely.
And you keep hitting back on the implied consent, and of course, the state has a right to regulate driving. When you put your name on that dotted line, then you've implied your consent to whatever they say. But shame on that legislature if they haven't passed the procedural laws that need to take place in order for that officer to, one, run that license plate and then make that stop. If they wanted to, they could, where I'm from in Michigan, they've passed the law, and that's all part of the procedures of your license status, is that a suspended driver can't obtain a license plate. Okay, and so how about we take it one step further and say, once a driver becomes suspended, it's one entry by whoever suspends the license, then you automatically invalidate the license plate. So that way it takes the police officers
it takes them out of the loop, Sean.
Standard and if you want to make police officers your procedural police officers, then give them the authority to do that and stop making this little we're trying to create a new reasonable assumption is what I'm all for the police, right?
Yes.
We're all for the police, but we want to do it the right way. We want better police officers. We don't need the MDT, the computer police out there running around, running every little license plate, and they should be looking for real bad guys in the neighborhood. What I believe.
What Sean's talking about is that there's a deficiency in the factual record of probable cause. And by diminishing that, we diminish all laws everywhere. And Sean, for that, not only do I applaud you, but I agree. And Brian, that leads right back to your argument. My point originally was that it was based on a hunch and that there's a common sense link here that these two things are related. But I see now that your point is that what we don't want to do is accidentally weaken other laws that are there to protect everybody's rights from intrusions.
Well, right, and that's the thing is that, and it goes back to, obviously what you said, and then what Sean brought up about the reasonable assumption, and factor in there this technology, which is still relatively new, and we're still like we don't have all the procedures like you guys are talking about, right? We don't have all these policies because these things haven't necessarily occurred or risen to that level where they need to be written yet, right? We don't know what we don't know, and so when something like this comes up, it's like, well, wait a minute, what is this a violation now of someone's civil liberties? And then you have to take into account, well, wait a minute, what are the roles and responsibilities of a driver on the road, right? Do you then, if you, I don't know, each state will likely be different, but if you have a revoked driver's license and you choose to drive anyway, I'm assuming, one, you're obviously already breaking the law because that's illegal, but there's got to be rights that you're then giving up because you chose to endanger people. You haven't followed the procedures of that state.
How is it
Therefore,
different than DUI? How is
right.
it different than driving under the influence of drugs? I completely agree with you.
Well, but the cause for stop and then the assumption is so here's the thing, and I think Glover tried to make, I think his attorney tried to make the argument, well, that's the reasonable assumption that the person driving the a vehicle that isn't registered or on a revoked license, actually the opposite would be true. If someone had a revoked license or their vehicle wasn't registered, they're less likely to drive. And then I think it was Justice Roberts said, actually,
Yep.
I would disagree with that and say it's
Exactly.
the other way, because since you've clearly demonstrated that you've already willing to break the laws or rules, and however
guys,
minor that rule is, you've already
exactly.
demonstrated the fact that because your license is revoked, you haven't followed policies and procedures so far.
Bad
You would
guys
likely
do
then
bad
continue
things.
to not follow policies and procedures. So
Yep.
I think that reasonable assumption, that's obviously can be subjective sometimes, or taken advantage of by a good attorney maybe, and how they word that. I don't know, Sean, if that's kind of what you were talking about with reasonable assumption.
Yeah, I'm just, you know what I mean? Reasonable assumption isn't a legal standard, but it seems to be that this is going to be the standard in this case. It was always reasonable suspicion that you could articulate. And there's a reason they didn't put that copper on the stand. The government didn't want that guy on the stand.
Exactly.
And it goes back to what I think is training. If he was a trained police officer, he would be able to articulate, like Terry v. Ohio, he could articulate why he did what he did. This officer couldn't.
There's two reasons they didn't want him on a stand, in my view, Sean, and I think you're exactly right. One, because he couldn't articulate past the fact that he learned how to type into a computer, and the computer would tell him what to do. But I think the second reason is because then they'll have plausible deniability when this case fails and goes back and is remanded down to a lower court. They can say, oh, well, you know what? We didn't lay the foundation, and because this officer's testimony wasn't there, that's why we recused ourselves from deciding on the case, which is a way of saving face. So I want to ask both of you, big brains, if you're thinking about this case, the reason I thought about it the way I did is, what about facial recognition capers? And they're coming, and sooner or later, it's not unlike this. The cop never observed the guy doing anything. But he gets notified by a pager that says, it's 214, has a warrant for his arrest. How is that different from the big picture of this case?
And there still has to be, and this is what comes down to, all right, let's take this case specifically. It wouldn't have been a case if this officer then, that it pinged on his computer, whatever. Oh, that vehicle license revoked. All right. Would it be now if he then looked at the description of Mr. Glover and then drove alongside the vehicle and made an observation saying he fits the general height, weight description of this, that photo is close enough, looks like the guy driving the vehicle, I can now then pull him over and there wouldn't be a case, right? Because I observed it. But that goes
what
into
you just did.
Yes.
What you just did is create a new standard that's not on the law. So I will agree with you that probable cause needs to be the standard. But we're in a new age of digital reasoning. And what I'm saying is that, was it enough for him to know that the license was revoked, which he knew? It's like a fellow officer affidavit. A computer is something that you can rely on. And then the intrusion was minor. So he pulled it over, walked up and said, yes or no, are you the registered owner and driver? And at that point, if it was his daughter, The daughter could have easily said, hey, it's
No.
my dad's car or whatever else. I think it's a reasonable intrusion. It's a low
But
level
we know that the
intrusion.
officer doesn't walk away. If he does say, no, this isn't the guy, do you think, in all honesty, that the officer's going to turn around and go, well, thank you, have a great day, and hand them back their license? If they think something's going on, is that just another way into the vehicle is what I'm saying. And
Yes,
I'm all
yes.
pro
Can
law
it be
enforcement.
abused?
Let's do it the right way.
Can it be abused? Yes. And the
And I think
problem
in
is
this
it'll
case-
make
right.
cops dumber. It'll make cops less
But
responsible.
I think
and
we're
it'll-
arguing the same thing, Greg. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
this goes
I
back
just
to- Go ahead.
here's the only thing. I agree with you, Shon. I'm violently in agreement where this could spiral out, and I think Brian is too. But my thing is, when we're talking about motor vehicles and the Carroll decision and less expectation of privacy, in this instance with this check, I'm kind of okay with it because of the intrusion level. Now, if the intrusion level is going to be fraught with likely abuse, maybe what we need to do is tell our lawmakers to stop worrying about all this crap that they're doing. They spent 3 years on doing nothing, and pick a caper like this and say, okay, we are going to set some real boundaries here.
Well, and here's the thing, but I mean, because then it goes down to I feel like we're gonna talk about this case again in a different form, right? Just like we did with the guys busted with 900 pounds of marijuana.
Yeah,
that
right,
was a
right.
bad stop. But here's the thing: is that let's say it wasn't Glover driving, let's say it was his friend, and he was legally driving the vehicle, he was insured, but he had
That's the person.
90 pounds of cocaine sitting on the passenger seat that he then observed. Would this then have been thrown out? I mean, just how would that have played out then if he said, well, no, you couldn't pull me over because, how does that play
I think
out?
a better case, Brian, I think a better case that you just hinted to would have been that somebody that had the permission of the revoked driver was driving the car,
Yes.
for example, to get a prescription at Rite Aid. And this guy is doing everything legal. He's got his insurance. The vehicle's up to snuff. That person bringing some sort of civil suit or that person arguing this caper, I would love that, because now you got a guy that did nothing wrong and the computer put him in the trick bag. Shon, you'd agree with that, yes?
I think we'd all agree on that.
Okay,
but I would disagree. I would disagree early what you said that a traffic stop isn't as a minor intrusion on your privacy.
I would disagree
I don't agree
with that too. Yeah.
How about my 17-year-old daughter? To her, that's anxiety driven. She's nervous. She doesn't know what to do. Right. So that's a big intrusion on your day.
I agree, but I'm trying to tell you that people that have nothing to hide should be hiding nothing. And therefore, if an officer had a mistake, and Shon, you and I have made mistakes on the road before where we stopped a guy based on somebody's description, or the vehicle was a bolo and we pull it over and it's full of nuns. You know what I'm saying? And they weren't part of the bolo.
But that's not the case. This is the MDT lottery going on here.
Okay, now that I'll agree with. If it's the MDT lottery, explain what you mean by that.
Well, when we worked the road, they were called MDTs. They morphed into computers, what they call now, laptop, whatever they are. But we had officers that we worked with that all day long, they would just punch in license plates into their MDT, because they weren't allowed to do that. If you remember, Greg, before we had the MDTs, we had to ask for a license plate to be ran over the air.
Exactly.
And how many tries did you get, Greg, on midnights when we worked midnights? How many tries did we get over the air?
If you did two and you weren't taking a felon to jail, then you weren't working midnights for very long. They would bully you into shutting up.
Yes, the dispatchers would say, "Oh, sorry, the computer's down," and that was their way of telling you, "Hey, get out there and keep looking, stop running plates, and get your face out there and find the bad guys."
Yeah, we used to call it fishing.
That didn't work, right? Fishing, fishing. And so, and what would happen then too, Greg? They kept trying to run them. What would we do? We take our mics, we start keying up the mics, but they couldn't get through to dispatch, and they got the point real quick that this isn't what police work's about. It's a tool,
but
don't
Shon,
abuse the tool.
You pulled the daughter card on me, and you make me feel like a boob now. I will pull this on you. What's the role of the supervisor on the road? What's the role of the road sergeant? What's the role of the lieutenant? Their role is to check those log sheets. Their role is to listen to that radio. Their role is to hold you accountable for every plate you run. Because when you go up there, that's an intrusion. You running a name on a computer is an intrusion in my privacy. So you should have a good reason for doing that, I believe. And then therefore, the low level of intrusion of stopping a car once you think you have something, because that's what reasonable suspicion is. You believe that you have something. This guy believed it was revoked. And so
Yeah,
I'm agreeing with
he
you in
assumed
principle.
he assumed it was the driver. There was no suspicion. Suspicion would have been like Brian said. Hey,
Yeah,
this man was
that
born in 1943,
that
and therefore
that's
he looks the age, he looks
that
the description. This is my man.
and that goes
I
back to the difference of what Sean brought up was reasonable assumption. That's not, you can't like, it has to be
We
reasonable
can't bolster
suspicion.
that to
And that
suspicion.
goes,
We have
because that goes back to their case is what the state was trying to say, because they kind of referenced a Terry v. Ohio case too, and they said, he initiate the stop to confirm or dispel the suspicion that Glover was violating Kansas law.
yes,
And they said it would have been poor police work for him to let Glover's truck continue to driving on, having known that the registered owner has a revoked license, which
that's my point.
that's true, right? Now that gets into a public safety concern. So either way, I just think that there has to be some way, because I can agree with that, right? I would 100% agree with, like, if this guy is been in 37 car accidents and his license been revoked for 10 years because he has done this, that, and the other thing. Okay, well, public safety would deem, hey, if it hits on my computer, I want to get him off the road. I think everyone would
That's why
agree with
it's on the computer.
that. Right.
That's why it's on the computer. And,
that,
then
driving is a privilege.
make the legislatures pass the laws so we can. The procedures is what you're saying, Greg. The procedural,
Exactly.
the implied consent. Then they're lacking. Not that the police officer shouldn't be there to assert their authority and make law out on the road. Is what I'm saying.
So I'll agree to
do
that. Brian, I'll agree to what Sean just said. I'll agree to take the cop out of the loop, because then it becomes just like a check in the box thing. It becomes a laminated check in the box, and it's a procedure
right. So
that the division of the driver's
saying
licensing
the
division.
law would have to be passed saying, if a police license plate reader reads your vehicle and the registered owner of that vehicle has a revoked license, they have an you will be pulled over.
Exactly, because driving is a privilege, not a
yes,
right. And then I would agree, and Sean, I think you would agree that I'm mistaken, because what I'm going into this is talking about a simple procedural fix to make sure that we don't realign the language of the Constitution, because I hear what you're saying about reasonable assumption not being there, but I think the assumption was reasonable because of the computer technology using, and I don't think the law is caught up with it. It's just like we have horizontal gaze nystagmus to figure out a driver's been drinking, but we're infants when it comes to testing for nystagmus from onset
lack of convergence and stuff.
lack
Yeah,
of convergence from
meaning
marijuana.
that goes into right what you're talking about with a lot of laws with how do we test someone how do we know if someone's under the influence of marijuana? Like, very easily standard for alcohol. We have it,
Exactly.
that's been established for a long time. So what is it now? We're passing laws before the enforcement can get up to them. And so let's go on to that next part. Then let's take both sides. What if this comes down saying, hey, no, that's now, that's not a reason to stop the vehicle or pull them over or have that intrusion of privacy, or it is, depending on which way the Supreme Court goes. What are the spirals that occur from there, right? Where will this lead to in terms of legal precedent?
Yeah, and I think Sean has a point that we need to bring up. Sean brought up some scar tissue. Brian, understand that if you did overtime for going to court, and your overtime went across so many minutes, it rounded up to the next hour, so you'd get like double time and a half. And so you'd have coppers that would be working your jurisdiction that their only job was to go out there and troll. That's why we called it fishing, until they found a likely candidate for driving while suspended second, which was
a 5 felons drove past him waving at him, right, Reem?
Exactly. And so you got a court misdemeanor that meant that you got guaranteed time, and you'd have be able to buy a bike for your kid for Christmas, sitting in court instead of doing your job. So what they would do is you'd have these coppers, these unscrupulous coppers, that would go out and make 25 or 30 traffic stops, many times not even calling them in until they had the guy, and they, I don't have my license, I have this, woo, now I got a candidate. Then they would run that guy, and sure enough, he'd come back, and you'd hear him right away say, yeah, I need that printed out and, stick it in my inbox because I know I'm going to court. Then they would pad these court dates, and that's all they did. They didn't care of the calls that were going out, the calls for service. They didn't care about self-initiated field activity, and the felons ran the streets. That's wrong. I think this case is emblematic of what could be. I think if you rely too much on the computers, what's happening is you're looking down and in instead of up and out, Brian. And I think that's a fear that I would have, and I bet Shon would echo that fear. But I also feel that I want to make sure that driving is a privilege, not a right. So therefore, if you intend to get behind the wheel of a car, then there are certain things that you should expect from law enforcement that now need to be codified that weren't before.
Yeah, but I think I would agree, but I think we're skipping a step. We're not there yet. And because the legislatures have shirked their responsibilities, I believe it puts the coppers in a bad light.
I agree.
When we're running around being the MDT police and not being the real police, then we have cases like this. These are the extreme edges of the law. The Constitution gives us great latitude. Terry v. Ohio is a great one. And so it shows us what case law can be. And this one here, I just think is going to set a bad precedent, and it's going to create a lot more computer police if it goes the government's way. It's going to create more computer police. And what I'm saying is I'm okay with all the tools that police officers have.
Right.
I don't think we need this tool. And if we do want to stop a suspended driver, then I guarantee you should be able to articulate why you stopped them. Use the reasonable suspicion doctrine and stop relying on a computer, or guess what? Just wave them by.
Or have a computer confirm your suspicion.
And that's what it comes down to as well with any technology is are we relying on the technology, or are we relying on the human with the technology as a tool? Because I think that goes to what Shon was talking about a lot of that. Then it becomes just relying on this machine. And then now that atrophies a number, like you just atrophies law enforcement experience, but it relies on that. And now it's not on human judgment and now it becomes that now this could get into a number of different areas. But I think, not relying simply on that technology, just using it as a tool or as some part of your investigation or some part of why, because
another tool in the toolbox.
You can't just rely on that stuff, because now that's going to lead to people getting pulled over, and let's say it is someone who's just innocently driving down the road. Now that's an invasion of their privacy. Now what happens to them because of this new law or new rule or new technology? I think that's where it gets into, and all these cases, I agree with what you said, Greg. It should, this should be a different case. Meaning, if it was his brother who had a perfectly clean driving record and it was legally operating that vehicle and he's insured, that this wouldn't be as much of a discussion.
Yeah,
but it still has to be, because now we're kind of starting to skate on thin ice there when it comes to civil liberties and the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution.
Yeah. So can I give you a better case, Brian? And I know we're getting near the closing remarks. So if you'll allow,
keep going, I think.
But if you allow me, okay, let me throw a good case at you. So you've got Al-Assad versus McAleenan in Boston. And yesterday, the federal court in Boston ruled that suspicionless searches of travelers' electronic devices by federal agents at airports and at other U.S. ports of entries are patently unconstitutional. So what they were in a policy of doing is, if you were coming from out Oconus, out of the country, they would just randomly grab your phone, your iPad, take a look at who you've been calling with no other suspicion. Now, to me, if you're talking about a lawsuit about electronics and about digital devices and everything else, this is the one that is the kind of thing you can get behind. Now, many people right now are cringing at home going, hey, wait a minute, that's how we find terrorists. No, you find terrorists by doing good police work.
Do police
you find
work,
terrorists by going out there and getting things called artifacts and evidence. So I know I sound dichotomous, but I wanna defend on Kansas and Glover. I want to defend my point there, saying that procedurally, I think it was a low-level intrusion, and I know I'm still getting beat up over that.
Yeah.
Here, when somebody's going to go into my phone or my iPad or my computer, that's a high-level intrusion, and you best come armed with bear before you do that, because you can't. Now, we're talking different on a Shon, for example, if we're doing a drug search warrant, and the search warrant says that the papers and the documents and the computer records and all that, and you're at the house, guess what? You're in the trick bag. I'm looking at your phone. But here we were talking about a border search with no probable cause, no suspicion whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that's a little, yeah, that's a huge jump from the caper we're in here. That's probably for another one, because that's going to be that's going to have huge ripples as well. And I obviously support you there too. We find bad guys by going to look for evidence, and that's the best way to find them, not rooting through people's iPhones. And back to the iPhone, what Brian was about technology, has technology made people more observant or less observant? And I'm arguing the same thing for police officers. The technology pulls us into the technology rather than looking up and out and looking at our environment, where we can find those reasonable suspicions and then articulate them.
Yeah.
So we're working on the good side, is what I'm saying.
We shouldn't lose our privacy rights when we're
Right.
on the phone. We shouldn't lose our privacy rights when we're on a bicycle or in a car or walking, as long as we're riding our bike or walking within the law. And you don't lose them even if you're a criminal. You still have the same basic rights. But I think that the overall goal of my being on today's podcast was to make sure that we don't endorse suspicionless fishing, but we also don't create this monster that can be handled with the swing of a gavel.
Yeah, and that goes into everything we kind of brought up, especially with Shon, and just you reiterated with the case you just brought up right now too, is that technology should use as an aid. There's no, hey, we have this tool now, we have this capability, this is what we've got now. Well, no, you still
one
like
more
you said,
artifact, one more item of evidence. Yes.
yeah, that's should be used in conjunction with something else, and that's why I brought up the example of okay, I got a ping on this license plate. I have to confirm this. I have to have some other probable cause and say this is likely the individual, because I would vehemently disagree with you saying getting pulled over by law enforcement is a minor intrusion. That is
absolutely minor.
Huge. I would disagree with that. I think that would be a major intrusion into your civil liberties, your ability to pass freely in just in this country alone. I think that's now they might be pulling you over in whatever the reason, right? So whether it's in terms of public safety, like this guy getting pulled over because he had a revoked license for whatever reason, okay, well, I guess if that's in terms of public safety, but it wasn't serious enough for you to pull him out of the vehicle and arrest him right there. So why was it serious enough for them to even have that intrusion, right? So I think this is kind of a not as you said, not the best case to use at all.
Yeah, go ahead, Shon.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in, we didn't really talk about it, but ultimately, these laws that are decided by men and women in black robes ultimately affect us little folk down on the roads and out in America.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And there are more neighborhoods that there are a lot of neighborhoods, obviously, in inner cities. If you've worked in an inner city or live in an inner city, and I know where I grew up in, I didn't grow up in a neighborhood, and neither did you two, that laws seem to affect us a little disproportionately. And it makes it a little more difficult out there. And I'm not trying to turn this into a whole societal discussion, but we have to work within our society construct of the Constitution. How is it in our society right now?
That's why it's a living, breathing document. That's why it moves and it grows and it changes for each one of us. And that's all I'm saying. Shon, where we grew up, if you were going to go into a bar, a nightclub, or you were going to go into an arena for a sporting event, and Brian, you're part of this too, because this is the same in Chicago as it was in Detroit. You're going to get your bag checked. You're going to get patted down. Right. You're going to go through a metal detector. That's an intrusion. But if you don't want to go into that place, you don't have to consent. So what's the difference in driving? In driving, you're implying that you are consenting to any of those things that are going to happen to you. So a traffic stop to find out if you're a revoked driver, to me, is a low-level intrusion. I just want to make sure that you understand.
By bringing up my point is, what I was trying to say is that in our family, we had hand-me-down cars, and we didn't have enough to go transfer the plate. And you're supposed to transfer that plate, but unless you have the money to transfer that plate, then you don't transfer it. So we didn't own an actual vehicle in our family's name until I was 13. And we had like a birthday cake to celebrate that. And we had hand-me-down vehicles. And so was my uncle suspended? I have no idea. But my mom was driving it. My dad was driving it. And what I'm saying is, we have to produce police officers that are a little better than this, is what I'm trying to say.
And I
a little more trained, a little more observant.
I agree with that, but I'm adding to that, Shon, that I think it's a function of the administration and leadership of that agency to hold their officers accountable. And I think that I would protract that out and say it's a responsibility of the legislature, of the lawmakers, to make good laws that are easy to enforce and that the people think are reasonable. Because if they're not reasonable on their face, you get what I'm saying? This is going to become case law, good, bad, or indifferent.
Right.
This is going to become case law, and they should have picked a better caper.
Yeah.
So I couldn't agree more. This is the best part where we've agreed. I think we all
Yeah.
agree that this is the absolute worst caper. Why the government got behind this case,
Right.
I have no idea.
I would again, if that, I think I would 100% agree with that. It's a bad caper for them to get behind. Why did this make it? How did this make it all the way up to the Supreme Court?
Exactly.
Should have been dealt with right away at a lower level where they went, you know what, it's not worth the time and effort on this one. Let's use it on the next one where it's worth it, because
exactly. And to plug this hole, Brian,
yeah,
to plug this hole, training changes behaviors.
right.
That law enforcement officer would have been better trained, then we wouldn't be having this discussion, because even if he got a ping on a revoke, and remember what Shon said, this is more screens. It wasn't the very first thing that he ran it and it came back revoked. He had to go and dig a little bit. If he would have been that zealous on finding probable cause and artifacts and evidence to support his conclusion, we wouldn't be having this argument.
And I agree.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, 100%. Because
training.
Who knows? It's an older model vehicle. With this guy, if he's a rule breaker and has been his whole life, then you could probably find something on that vehicle that's worthy of a stop. Say, hey,
and he's going to do something wrong.
Or
bad
you can
people
follow
do bad
right?
things.
He's going to cross the line. He's not going to use his signal. Whatever the issue is, you'll get it. So I just think that extra effort. But and again, we can.
How about the next day? Obviously, he's going somewhere, and he's probably going to be moving about the next day too. So meet him at the same bat time, same bat channel, and I guarantee you, you'll have him the next day. So,
and what Shon just said to our loyal listeners out there is the gift of time and distance.
Yep.
Being prudent and slowing time down and saying, listen, probable cause doesn't diminish. So if we see him again tomorrow driving, then it's clear that he's a scofflaw.
Yeah, I
totally agree.
And then submit the warrant for the day before. Also, if you do find out, then you've got. Then if you had such a,
exactly.
You were so hard up to get this guy, then you could also seek the warrant for the day prior and the day that you got him.
And now your probable cause is the warrant. And that's what the court wants you to do, is not do warrantless affidavits, right? So now you're right on, Shon. So now we don't need a new law. What you're talking about is going back to the same old law and doing good police work on the ground.
Yeah, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right?
Exactly.
So I've been told. I've still never skinned a cat before in my life, but I've heard that term in a number of places, and everyone keeps saying it
in different variations as well.
But I think that's a good point, and I know we could keep going on with this and case law for a while, but I think this is a good one to highlight a number of issues. One, especially with technology use, still comes down. All of these cases that we've discussed comes down to, because once again, this is another case we discussed where the police officer pulled over the guy who was doing something wrong. So the guy was clearly breaking the law, and it's just, what if he had taken that extra time, or what if he had done one more step, or just getting that, just like we talk about, that time and distance, and we can go on forever. Who knows, that guy might have had 37 other things to do and been overworked in this, right? We don't even know, but we're just taking on the facts of the case, and what it leads to is that, look, this is what happens then you get a crap case that makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and all you had to do was take that extra step. And I'm not admonishing him. I'm certainly not going to Monday morning quarterback the police officer doing it, but just talking about it from a legal standpoint, this is then what happens. And we forget that sometimes when we're out there, right? That, this is what it could possibly lead to. So
from good old road cops, Brian, good old road cops, you do not want your name on case law. You know what I'm saying? Shon, am I saying the gospel there?
Oh, that's the gospel truth.
So give yourself the gift of time and distance, and training changes behavior. All right, I think this is a good spot to kind of end on, unless there's something else you guys want to add.
No, Shon, great to have you back on the pod, buddy.
Yeah.
Thanks. The only thing I'd add, we got any state reps that are out there, try my idea. How about with the suspended drivers, we cancel their plate as soon as they become suspended. End of discussion.
Yeah, and there it takes the onus off the cop and the motor vehicle department, and puts the onus on the driver owner to go in and get it corrected. And guess what? All the money, the funding has to come from that guy or girl,
to reinstate the plate.
You're exactly right.
It's a good point.
So the state wins, the coppers win, and society at large wins.
Oh, come on, man! But the bad guy keeps losing.
Brian, just change sides, Brian.
All right.
Exactly.
Come to the light side, Brian.
I still got that ankle bracelet on. I can't leave my box here. So, all right. Thanks for coming on too, Shon. All right. Thanks for everyone.
Thanks for inviting me, guys.
Hey, remember everybody, November's Resilience Month here at Arcadia. We love you.